On paper, George Michael's success looks like a victory you can count. Global superstardom, millions of records moved, a catalog that still fills rooms decades later. But the most revealing number in his story isn't measured in chart points. It's measured in money he refused to be praised for. In the mid-1990s, Jesus to a Child rose as a quiet, aching hit. Yet the royalties didn't become a new luxury, a new headline, or a new trophy. They vanished into Childline because George chose to donate the single's earnings and demanded one condition. No credit, no announcements, no halo. Why would a man who could sell millions fear recognition more than he feared losing money? And what does it mean when the kindest part of a legend has to be kept secret to remain true? To understand why Jesus to a Child became more than a song, you have to step back into the machinery that built George Michael in the first place. The George the world first bought was fast, bright, uncomplicated, wham! As a neon export, youth as a product you could package and ship. Then the solo era arrived, and faith turned him into a global unit of measurement. More than 14 million copies sold. A look, a voice, and a brand powerful enough to bend an entire decade's pop culture around its orbit. But success at that level doesn't simply give you freedom. It recruits you into a system that needs you to stay consistent so it can stay profitable. Labels build schedules, radio strategies, promotional calendars, image plans. Fans build expectations. Tabloids build narratives. In the late 80s and 90s, record contracts could lock an artist into a long corridor of obligations, and George, who wanted to mature to write deeper, darker, more intimate songs, began pushing against the corridor walls. That tension is where his later choices start to make sense. Because the conflict wasn't only artistic. It was also personal, and it belonged to its time. The AIDS crisis sat over the culture like a permanent alarm, and public conversation around sexuality was often cruel, simplistic, and hungry for punishment. For many gay men of that era, privacy wasn't comfort, it was armor. George learned to live split. The public self that had to be charming, controlled, safe, and the private self that carried real love, real fear, real grief. That split life does something subtle and brutal. It turns honesty into risk, and risk into exhaustion. And then came Anselmo Felipa, the love that made George feel briefly ordinary, briefly out of the marketplace. And then came the loss that made him feel life itself was an agreement you could never renegotiate. From there, the legal war with Sony, the phrase professional slavery. The courtroom logic and corporate power, those weren't random chapters. They were the same story expressed in a different language. Control. Who owns the work? Who owns the image? Who owns the narrative? And if the public can buy your songs and the industry can schedule your life, what is left that is purely yours? This is why Jesus to a Child matters. It wasn't just a hit. It was a private grief translated into something the world could sing along to. And when the money arrived, money that would normally become proof of success, George quietly redirected it to Childline and insisted on silence. In a life where so much was extracted, negotiated, and consumed, anonymous giving became one of the few spaces where he could act without being turned into a product. The question, then, isn't simply why did he donate? The real question is darker. What was he trying to protect? His kindness, his privacy, or the last piece of himself the world couldn't monetize? The key to George Michael's contradictions is not that he had two lives, public and private, but that the distance between those lives kept widening as he aged, until even success couldn't bridge it. His early years set the pattern. A boy shaped by a household where love and expectation arrived in the same sentence, where identity was something you negotiated rather than simply lived. When Wham! Detonated, that negotiation became global. Overnight, he wasn't just making music, he was being interpreted, consumed, simplified. Pop stardom rewards clarity, and George's early image was a kind of cultural shorthand. Fun, handsome, confident, flirtatious, easy. The problem is that George was never easy inside. He had the instincts of a songwriter who wanted permanence, not just applause, and he had the sensitivity of someone who understood that performance can become a prison if you're not allowed to evolve. Then faith happened and the scale changed. This is the cruel irony of selling at that level. The world tells you you're free because you're rich, but the industry tells you you're not free because you're valuable. A multi-platinum artist becomes a schedule, a marketing plan, a set of deliverables. The label needs continuity. The media needs access. The audience needs the version of you they first fell in love with. And George, who wanted to step out of the poster and into adulthood, began to feel the first deep fracture. The more he grew, the more he was punished for changing. That's where the fight over control begins. Not as a dramatic moment in a courtroom, but as a daily erosion. Who gets to decide when you release music? What your album looks like? How you appear on television? How often you tour? How you explain yourself? For most people, these are career choices. For George, they became identity choices, because his identity was already under surveillance in a culture that treated sexuality like a scandal headline waiting to happen. The late 80s and early 90s were not built for gentle honesty. The AIDS crisis was not just a medical catastrophe. It was a moral theater in the media, and in that theater, gay men were often treated as warnings instead of human beings. In that climate, privacy wasn't a preference. Privacy was safety. So George learned to protect himself by splitting, giving the public what it demanded while keeping the truth where it couldn't be weaponized. But living split has consequences. When you can't be fully seen, even love becomes risky, because love wants daylight. This is why Anselmo Felipe matters so much in the architecture of his life. Anselmo wasn't merely a partner. He was a doorway to a future where George could be ordinary, where the most important person in the room wasn't an audience, but one human being who knew him without the costume. And then that doorway slammed shut. The loss hit at the exact point when George was already questioning what fame was doing to him, and grief doesn't politely stay in one compartment. It leaks into everything, into work, into trust, into sleep, into the way you see the world's fairness. For someone who had spent years keeping parts of himself private, grief became even more dangerous because it was difficult to mourn openly without inviting scrutiny. The pain had to be translated. It had to become art. And that translation is where Jesus to a Child becomes a central clue. The song is quiet on purpose. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need spectacle. It sounds like a person speaking softly because anything louder might break him. In a culture that still expected pop stars to project control, this was George allowing fragility into the public space, but in a coded form that still protected the private reality underneath. Now here's the pivot that turns this from a music story into a moral story. The moment money arrived from that single, George didn't allow it to become a public victory. He redirected the royalties to Childline and asked for silence. That choice looks simple until you realize what it implies. It implies that George saw how quickly goodness can be converted into a brand asset, how charity can become a costume, how the media can turn kindness into a headline that still extracts something from you. George refused that extraction. He didn't just give. He insisted on giving in a way that denied the system its favorite fuel. A narrative of redemption packaged for public consumption. That insistence wasn't only humility. It was control over the one thing he could still control without lawyers, without labels, without tabloids. When the world demanded a performance, anonymous generosity was a performance he could refuse. It was an act that belonged entirely to him. And that is where the story darkens, because the same mechanism that makes anonymous giving feel pure can also isolate you. If your best self must remain hidden to remain safe, then the world ends up knowing you mainly through your worst moments. And George had worst moments, moments the culture seized, amplified, and replayed. Scandal didn't just happen to him. Scandal became a lens through which many people tried to reduce him. What made George different is that he sometimes refused to accept shame as the final verdict. He could take the humiliation the world offered and turn it into art that mocked the machinery itself, signaling, "The tabloids don't get to own the meaning of my life." But that kind of defiance has a hidden cost. When you become skilled at turning pain into public armor, you risk losing the habit of asking for help in private. Survival becomes a style, and style can keep you alive while still leaving you alone. This is where the professional slavery war fits in, not as a detached legal episode but as the same psychological struggle in a different arena. When George described his relationship with the label in those terms, it was not merely exaggeration for drama. It was the language of someone who felt owned. And feeling owned is particularly destabilizing for someone whose identity already required self-protection. The lawsuit, in that sense, was a declaration. If the world insists on consuming me, then at least it will not consume my art without a fight. But systems rarely like being challenged. Losing that fight did more than slow down releases. It likely reinforced a devastating lesson. Even at the highest level, autonomy is conditional. If you can sell millions and still be boxed in, what does freedom even mean? That realization can push a person toward withdrawal, toward guardedness, toward a smaller circle, toward the belief that safety is found only behind locked doors. And yet George couldn't fully withdraw because his gift demanded expression. He kept returning, releasing work that sounded like it came from someone who had lived through too much noise and wanted quiet. He kept trying to craft a life that wasn't always under floodlights. That's where later relationships, like the long domestic chapter with Kenny Goss, matter not as gossip, but as a sign that George craved stability the way a dehydrated man craves water. Stability, however, is not guaranteed just because you want it. Fame distorts relationships by introducing invisible questions into every room. Are you loved for who you are, or for what you represent? Is your home a sanctuary or a stage? Is your partner a partner or an unintended co-star in the public narrative? Those questions can corrode even good love over time, because they poison trust with constant uncertainty. And when trust becomes hard, loneliness becomes inevitable, not because you're physically alone, but because you're emotionally guarded. Now circle back to the Childline decision, because it's the emotional center of this entire script. Donating the Jesus to a child royalties isn't just a generous gesture. It's George choosing to convert private grief into public good without allowing public attention to touch it. It's the purest expression of his central contradiction. A man who wanted to be seen through his music, not through his life, yet who kept being dragged into visibility on the harshest possible terms. By giving anonymously, he protected the meaning of his act. But he also ensured that, in the public record, the act didn't exist, at least not until later. That creates a painful imbalance. The world keeps a loud archive of the scandal, the lawsuit, the controversy, the caricature, while the most human parts of him remain uncredited. And when an artist's public identity is built mainly from what is loud, the artist can begin to believe that being truly known is impossible. At that point, charity becomes more than kindness. It becomes self-preservation. If you cannot control the narrative, you can at least control one corner of reality where you do something good and no one can twist it. But notice what that also suggests: that George was living in a world where even goodness felt unsafe in public. That is not a personal flaw. That is an indictment of the culture around celebrity. The final layer of his deep cause is the one most viewers miss because it isn't dramatic. The slow cumulative exhaustion of living as an icon. Icons don't get to be tired. Icons don't get to be messy in private without the mess being sold. Icons don't get to have a bad year and a quiet recovery. They get to have a headline and a punchline. George fought this with defiance, with silence, with art, with kindness. But none of those strategies automatically produce belonging. Belonging requires a stable environment where you can be wholly seen and not punished for it. George's era gave him fame faster than it gave him safety. It gave him money faster than it gave him peace. It gave him a legacy faster than it gave him a life he could live without armor. And that is the tragedy sitting underneath the Childline story. The fact that he used the most vulnerable song in his catalog as a vehicle for secret compassion, almost as if he was trying to build a private sanctuary out of public success. The viewer is left with a question that becomes heavier the longer it hangs. If the truest parts of George Michael were the parts he kept hidden, his grief, his tenderness, his quiet generosity, then what does it say about the world that it took death, not life, for those parts to be widely seen? George Michael's hidden Childline decision only becomes fully legible when it's placed beside other artists who fought the same era's machinery, but chose different survival strategies. Start with Prince. The image of an artist writing "slave" to protest contracts became a blunt visual translation of what George described in legal language, an industry that could treat creativity like a leased asset. Prince weaponized spectacle to force the public to look. George, by contrast, often tried to starve the spectacle. Pulling back, resisting promotion, redirecting attention away from himself and toward the work. Then look at Elton John, another British superstar who endured ruthless press culture, yet built a public path toward stability by leaning into openness over time, turning visibility into a shield instead of a trap. George's trajectory shows the opposite gamble. If openness risks becoming a tabloid weapon, secrecy can feel safer, even if it costs you intimacy. Neither approach is morally superior. They reveal how timing, temperament, and social climate decide what survival looks like. Now bring in Freddie Mercury as a generational mirror. The late 80s AIDS-era atmosphere taught many artists that private life was not a neutral fact. It was a battlefield. In that world, withholding wasn't always denial. It was protection. George lived long enough to watch society soften in some places, to watch public norms shift, to watch conversations about LGBTQ+ identity become more humane. Yet the psychological habits formed under older dangers don't disappear just because the headlines improve. If you spend decades learning that exposure equals punishment, you don't suddenly relax because the culture updates its vocabulary. And that leads to a key consequence. George's loneliness cannot be explained only by personality or relationships. It was also produced by infrastructure, media incentives, tabloid economics, contract power, and the historical scarcity of safe public spaces for certain kinds of truth. Britain's tabloid culture especially shaped the stakes. In some celebrity ecosystems, scandal burns fast and then fades. In others, scandal becomes a permanent label that resurfaces whenever you attempt reinvention. That permanence matters because George's story is fundamentally a story of reinvention. From Wham's neon simplicity to an adult emotional register, from poster boy certainty to complex vulnerability, from public charm to private boundaries, reinvention requires room. A culture that monetizes humiliation steals room. And then there's the legal and social question of partnership, especially in LGBTQ+ lives across the late 20th century. It's easy for modern viewers to assume that love automatically comes with protection. Shared life, shared rights, shared recognition. But for many years that was not guaranteed, and the lack of stable recognition didn't just affect paperwork, it affected psychology. It encouraged secrecy, made domestic life feel provisional, and created fear around legacy. Who gets to speak for you? Who gets believed? Who gets to define your story when you can't? In famous lives, this becomes even harsher because everything is contested. Homes become assets, relationships become narratives, grief becomes a headline, and kindness becomes a branding opportunity. George's decision to donate Jesus to a child royalties anonymously is therefore not just a sweet story. It is a response to a world where even goodness can be extracted and repackaged. But that response produces a second consequence. The public ends up knowing him mainly through what was loud. The lawsuit, the backlash, the controversy, while his best self stays uncredited. And when your best self is invisible, you start living in an emotional imbalance. The world punishes you publicly for your worst chapters, while the private chapters that might restore your dignity are locked away for safety. This is why the Childline story hits so hard when it finally surfaces. The audience realizes the ledger was incomplete. The world had been reading the wrong biography, one written by incentives, not by truth. Yet the cruelest consequence is the timing. If the most human evidence of who George was becomes widely known only later, then the person who needed that recognition, not applause but understanding, doesn't get to feel it in real time. So the real comparison isn't only artist versus label or openness versus secrecy. It's a comparison of outcomes. In systems that turn identity into content, how many brilliant people learn to protect themselves by shrinking? And when they shrink, how often does the world mistake that shrinking for arrogance, distance, or coldness, when it was actually self-defense all along? The solution to a George Michael story cannot be a simple moral like be kinder or be stronger, because he already was kind, and he already survived more storms than most people face in a lifetime. The deeper lesson is about systems, what they reward, what they punish, and what kind of people they quietly break. If a number one single can generate money that an artist feels compelled to hide inside charity in order to keep it pure, that's not only a statement about George's character. It's a statement about how toxic public meaning can become around celebrity. So the first solution has to live in the industry itself. contracts and deal structures that treat artists as partners, not leased properties. That means clearer terms around creative control, release strategy, and promotional expectations, plus protections that normalize pauses, not as failure, but as necessary maintenance for human beings who are asked to perform under constant scrutiny. It also means early legal literacy for artists, not just lawyers who negotiate, but independent advisors who explain incentives in plain language. George's professional slavery phrase landed because it described a real asymmetry. The system is built so that even the biggest stars can feel trapped. The second solution is mental health infrastructure that isn't a PR footnote. If celebrity is a form of chronic exposure, then protection can't begin only after crisis. It has to be proactive. Labels, management, touring structures, every part of the pipeline needs to stop treating emotional collapse as collateral damage and start treating long-term well-being as a core KPI, because burned-out artists are not a romance story. They are a predictable result of incentives. The third solution belongs to media and to audiences. Tabloids and online cycles have historically profited from humiliation, and consumers have historically paid the price with clicks. If we want fewer legends who retreat into silence, we have to mature beyond the belief that admiration purchases ownership. Loving an artist's work is not the same as owning their private life. George's hidden Childline decision is an argument for a different ethic. Some acts are sacred precisely because they refuse the camera. When culture learns to respect that boundary, artists don't have to choose between being human and being visible. The fourth solution is societal, especially around LGBTQ+ safety and dignity. The long shadow of the AIDS era and the cruelty of older public norms created habits of secrecy that didn't vanish simply because the world improved later. If society wants healthier outcomes, it has to make safety real. Not just in law, but in everyday public empathy, so that people don't build their entire adult lives around fear of exposure. Now the future. George Michael's legacy is already shifting in the way legacies often shift when the noise dies down and the facts start to surface. For years, many people understood him through the loudest narrative: controversy, conflict, defiance. But stories like the Childline Royalties donation reveal a different center of gravity. A man who used wealth not as armor but as quiet rescue, who resisted turning goodness into marketing, who built private meaning in a public world. Over time, that may become the dominant lens. Not a perfect saint, not a scandal caricature, but a human being negotiating impossible contradictions, fighting for artistic autonomy, stumbling in public, then returning to the one place he could still act freely: compassion without credit. The best forecast for his legacy is that his music will remain the surface, what people sing, while his hidden generosity becomes the depth, what people remember when they want to believe fame doesn't automatically erase a person's soul. And if that is the future, then the real point of telling this story isn't nostalgia. It's instruction. Build systems where artists don't have to disappear to stay human, and build cultures where kindness doesn't have to hide to remain true. George Michael's Childline decision is haunting because it flips the usual celebrity script. Most fame stories move from talent to money to applause. This one moves from grief to song to money, and then, quietly, to children he would never meet. Jesus to a Child became a public confession disguised as a pop release, and the Royalties became a private rebellion. Proof that he could still do something pure in a world that tried to turn everything into content. But the final contradiction remains. If he was capable of that level of compassion, why did he still end up carrying so much loneliness? Because generosity, even at its most beautiful, is not the same as belonging. Charity can save someone else's night. It doesn't always save the giver from the long exhaustion of being watched, interpreted, and reduced. And maybe that's the sharpest lesson this story leaves behind. The world is often late to recognize the quiet parts of people, especially the famous ones. We celebrate the hits in real time, but we discover the hidden decency only after it can no longer comfort the person who carried it. So if there's a human message here, it's not to mythologize George Michael as either hero or headline. It's to see him as a man who fought for control, lost battles, won others in silence, and kept trying to translate pain into something that helped someone else breathe. If this changed the way you hear his music, comment the one George Michael song that feels like his real heart to you, not the poster version. Subscribe for more untold stories that separate myth from mechanism. And share this video with someone who thinks they already know George, because the truest parts of his story were the parts he never wanted credited.